What happens when Hollywood's most famously private actor gets ambushed by questions he explicitly asked not to be asked? What happens when a late-night host decides to go for viral moments instead of respecting his guests' boundaries? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most uncomfortable and explosive interviews in late-night television history, where Harrison Ford completely lost it on Stephen Colbert in front of a live studio audience. This isn't your typical celebrity meltdown. This is a masterclass in how quickly an interview can spiral out of control when egos clash and respect goes out the window. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts pushing guests too far for content. The tension was brewing long before the cameras started rolling. Harrison Ford had agreed to appear on The Late Show to promote his latest project, but his publicist had been crystal clear about the ground rules. No questions about his personal life, no questions about his past relationships, and absolutely no questions about his well-documented struggles with anxiety during interviews. Stephen Colbert's team had agreed to these terms, but as we'll see, agreements don't always hold up under the bright lights of late-night television. When Ford walked onto that stage, everything seemed normal. The audience erupted in applause for the legendary actor, and Colbert greeted him with his trademark grin and enthusiastic handshake. Ford, dressed in his usual casual blazer and jeans, looked relaxed as he settled into the guest chair. The first few minutes went exactly as planned. Harrison Ford, welcome back to The Late Show. Colbert began with his practiced charm. Always great to have you here. Thanks for having me, Stephen, Ford replied in his familiar gravelly voice, though those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. Colbert started with softball questions about Ford's new film, the kind of promotional content that everyone expected. Ford answered with his typical dry wit, getting laughs from the audience when he deadpanned about the physical demands of action scenes at his age. You know, people keep asking me when I'm going to slow down, Ford said, leaning back in his chair. I tell them I'll slow down when directors stop offering me roles where I get to punch people. The audience laughed, and Colbert chuckled along. Speaking of punching people, I have to ask about some of your more intense co-stars over the years. Ford's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly. What do you mean by intense? Well, you've worked with some pretty big personalities, Colbert continued, his smile never wavering. Some demanding leading ladies. Some difficult directors. Any stories you can share about personality clashes on set? I prefer to keep things professional, Ford replied curtly. The people I work with are professionals, and I treat them as such. Colbert nodded, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't satisfied with that answer. Of course. Professional is your middle name. But come on, in 40-plus years in this business, there must be some behind-the-scenes drama you can share with us. Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Stephen, I'm here to talk about my current project. That's what we agreed on. Right, Colbert said, but his tone had changed. There was an edge creeping in, a sense that he was testing boundaries. But our audience loves these stories. They want to know what Harrison Ford is really like when the cameras aren't rolling. What I'm really like is someone who honors agreements, Ford said, his voice dropping to that dangerous low register that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as a warning sign. But Colbert either didn't pick up on the warning or chose to ignore it. Well, speaking of agreements, I know your publicist sent over some guidelines, but honestly, Harrison, don't you think the audience deserves a little more than just promotional talk? They came here to see the real you. The audience murmured, sensing something shifting in the dynamic between host and guest. Ford's hands, which had been relaxed on the armrests, were now gripping them slightly. The real me is sitting right here answering your questions about my work, Ford said evenly. That should be enough. Should be, sure, Colbert replied, his smile becoming more forced. But let's be honest. You've got a reputation for being, shall we say, difficult in interviews. Some might say you're not exactly giving us your best effort here tonight. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ford stared at Colbert for a long moment, his famous intensity now fully focused on the host. Difficult? Is that what you call having boundaries? I call it being evasive. Colbert shot back, abandoning all pretense of friendliness. You're one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and you're acting like every question is some kind of personal attack. Ford leaned forward in his chair, his voice deadly quiet. Stephen, I agreed to come on your show. I didn't agree to be insulted. I'm not insulting you, Colbert replied, but his body language suggested otherwise. I'm trying to have a real conversation, not some sanitized press junket nonsense. Real conversation? Ford's voice was rising now, though he was clearly fighting to maintain control. Real conversation would involve mutual respect, something you seem to have forgotten. The audience was dead silent now, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Colbert, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, tried to backtrack. Look, Harrison, I didn't mean to. Yes, you did. Ford cut him off. You meant every word. You think because you've got a camera rolling and an audience watching, you can say whatever you want, and I'll just sit here and take it. Colbert's mask was slipping completely now. I think you're being oversensitive. This is late-night television, not a therapy session. That comment hit Ford like a physical blow. His face darkened, and when he spoke again, his voice was like steel. Oversensitive? You want to see oversensitive? The studio went completely silent. Everyone could sense that something was about to explode, and Harrison Ford was reaching his breaking point. Stephen Colbert had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected actors too far, and the consequences were about to unfold in spectacular fashion. Ford stood up from his chair so abruptly that it nearly tipped over backward. The sudden movement caused several audience members to gasp, and you could see Colbert's eyes widen in genuine surprise. This wasn't going according to any script he had in mind. You know what, Stephen? Ford's voice boomed across the studio, his famous composure completely shattered. You want oversensitive? Here's oversensitive for you. I've been doing this job for over 4 decades. I've worked with the best directors in Hollywood. I've been in some of the biggest movies ever made, and I've never, not once, had a host sit there and deliberately try to humiliate me on national television. Colbert, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of Ford's reaction, tried to regain control. Harrison, please sit down. Let's just... No, Ford cut him off, his finger pointing directly at the host. You don't get to tell me what to do now. You had your chance to be professional, and you blew it. You think this is entertainment? You think making your guests uncomfortable is comedy? The audience was frozen in their seats, witnessing something they had never seen before. This wasn't a planned bit or a staged moment. This was raw, unfiltered anger from one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. I'm trying to give our audience what they want, Colbert said, his own voice rising now. They don't want to hear you recite talking points about your latest movie. They want to see who Harrison Ford really is. Who I really am. Ford's laugh was bitter and sharp. I'll tell you who I really am, Stephen. I'm someone who shows up to work, does my job professionally, and treats people with respect. But apparently, respect is a foreign concept to you. Colbert stood up from behind his desk, clearly agitated. You're being ridiculous. This is how late-night television works. We push a little, we get real reactions, we entertain people. It's not personal. Not personal? Ford's voice cracked with incredulity. You just called me difficult and oversensitive on live television. How is that not personal? You agreed to certain boundaries, and the moment those cameras started rolling, you decided those agreements meant nothing. Those boundaries were ridiculous. Colbert shot back, his own anger finally showing. You're a public figure. You don't get to control every aspect of how people talk to you. The studio audience was completely silent now, watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold. Some people had their phones out, clearly recording what would become viral clips within hours. Control? Ford stepped closer to Colbert's desk, his presence commanding the entire space. You think asking for basic professional courtesy is about control? You think not wanting my personal life dissected for your ratings is unreasonable? I think you've forgotten what business you're in, Colbert replied coldly. You make millions of dollars being famous. Part of that deal is answering questions you might not love. Ford's face went completely red. Are you seriously lecturing me about my career? You think because you have a television show, you get to decide what's appropriate? I've been doing this since before you were out of college, and I've never had someone be this unprofessional. Unprofessional? Colbert laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're the one having a meltdown on my show. You're the one who can't handle a few simple questions. Simple questions? Ford's voice was shaking with rage now. You called me difficult. You questioned my professionalism. You deliberately ignored every agreement your producers made with my people. And now you're trying to make this my fault? Colbert moved around his desk, facing Ford directly. Maybe if you weren't so uptight about everything, we could have had a normal conversation. But no, everything has to be on Harrison Ford's terms, doesn't it? My terms. Ford was incredulous. My terms were that we talk about my work and treat each other with respect. Apparently, that's too much to ask from you. You know what? Colbert's voice was getting sharper, more cutting. Maybe your reputation for being difficult in interviews is well-deserved. Maybe the problem isn't the interviewers. Maybe it's you. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Ford stared at Colbert for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. That's it, Ford said, his tone carrying a finality that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. I've heard enough. He started to remove his microphone, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed fury. You want to know what's difficult, Stephen? What's difficult is sitting here listening to you trash my reputation because I won't play your little games. Harrison, come on, Colbert said, perhaps finally realizing he had gone too far. Let's just— No, Ford interrupted, his voice cutting through the studio like a knife. We're done. I came here to do a job, to promote my work, to give your audience something worth watching. Instead, you decided to turn this into some kind of power trip. Colbert's face was flushed now, his own anger boiling over. Fine. If you can't handle being challenged, then maybe you should have stayed home. Ford stopped removing his microphone and looked directly at Colbert, his eyes blazing with fury. Challenged? You think what you're doing is challenging me? You're not challenging anything, Stephen. You're just being cruel. Cruel? Colbert scoffed. This is television, Harrison. If you can't take the heat— Don't you dare! Ford's voice thundered across the studio, louder than anyone had ever heard it before. Don't you dare give me some cliched line about taking the heat. I've been taking heat my entire career. I've dealt with demanding directors, impossible schedules, physical injuries, and press that would make your head spin. But I've never had to deal with someone who pretends to be professional while systematically trying to destroy my credibility. The audience was completely mesmerized by this display of raw emotion from someone known for being intensely private and controlled. Colbert, meanwhile, seemed to be realizing that he had unleashed something he couldn't control. You're overreacting, Colbert said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Am I? Ford's laugh was harsh and bitter. Let me tell you what overreacting would be, Stephen. Overreacting would be me walking off this stage right now and making sure everyone in this industry knows exactly what kind of host you really are. The threat hung in the air, and you could see Colbert's face pale slightly. In Hollywood, Harrison Ford's word carried enormous weight, and both men knew it. You wouldn't do that, Colbert said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Ford smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Try me. The silence that followed Ford's threat was deafening. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath from the studio audience, and several crew members had stopped what they were doing to stare at the unfolding drama. Colbert's face had gone from flushed anger to a pale realization of what he might have just unleashed. Harrison, Colbert started, his voice notably less confident than it had been moments before. Let's not do anything we'll regret. Ford's eyes narrowed dangerously. Regret? The only thing I regret is agreeing to come on this show in the first place. But you know what I don't regret? Standing up to someone who thinks his platform gives him the right to treat people like garbage. I never treated you like garbage, Colbert protested, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. No? Ford's voice dripped with sarcasm. You called me difficult. You said I was being evasive. You told me I was oversensitive. You questioned my professionalism in front of millions of people. What exactly would you call that behavior, Stephen? Colbert looked around the studio, perhaps hoping for some kind of intervention from his producers, but everyone seemed frozen in place, witnessing this career-defining moment unfold in real time. Look, Colbert said, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for conciliation, if not for the defensive edge still present. Maybe we both got a little heated. Maybe we should just— Maybe, Ford interrupted, his voice rising again. Maybe we got heated? Stephen, you systematically violated every agreement your people made with mine. You deliberately pushed buttons you knew were off limits. And now you want to play it off like we're both equally responsible? I was doing my job, Colbert said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Your job? Ford laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Your job is to entertain people, not to humiliate your guests. Your job is to make people want to watch your show, not to make them uncomfortable witnessing you attack someone who came here as a favor to you. Colbert's jaw tightened. Nobody forced you to be here, Harrison. You came here to promote your movie, and I gave you a platform to do it. A platform? Ford's voice was incredulous. You gave me a platform? Let me explain something to you, Stephen. I don't need your platform. I don't need your show. I don't need anything from you. I came here because my publicist thought it would be good for the film, but I can promise you this, that was the last favor anyone associated with me will ever do for this show. The threat landed like a physical blow. In the entertainment industry, being blacklisted by someone of Harrison Ford's stature could have serious implications for a talk show's ability to book major guests. You're threatening my show now? Colbert asked, his own anger flaring back to life. I'm not threatening anything, Ford replied coldly. I'm making a promise. You want to treat your guests like this? You want to ignore professional agreements and attack people's reputations? Fine. But actions have consequences, and you're about to learn what those consequences look like. You can't intimidate me, Harrison, Colbert said, trying to project strength he clearly didn't feel. Ford stepped closer to Colbert, his presence filling the space between them. Intimidate you? Stephen, I don't need to intimidate you. You've done this to yourself. You had one of the most respected actors in Hollywood sitting in that chair, willing to have a pleasant conversation about his work, and you chose to turn it into a public execution. That's on you, not me. I was trying to get real content, Colbert protested weakly. Real content? Ford's voice was heavy with disgust. You think attacking someone's character is real content? You think making your guest uncomfortable is entertaining? Let me tell you what real content looks like, Stephen. Real content is when your guest feels comfortable enough to share genuine insights about their work. Real content is when you create an environment where interesting stories can emerge naturally. Real content isn't ambushing someone and then acting shocked when they defend themselves. Colbert looked around the studio again, clearly struggling to find a way out of the hole he had dug for himself. Maybe we can start over, he said desperately. Maybe we can. Start over? Ford's laugh was sharp and bitter. You think you can just reset this? You think you can unsay everything you've said? Stephen, this isn't a rehearsal. This is live television. Millions of people just watched you show exactly what kind of person you really are, and millions of people just watched me respond to it. There's no starting over from this. So what do you want from me? Colbert asked, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. Ford stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. I want you to remember this moment, Stephen. I want you to remember what it feels like when someone treats you with the same disrespect you showed me tonight. And most importantly, I want you to think about whether this is really the kind of host you want to be. With that, Ford reached down and completely removed his microphone, setting it carefully on Colbert's desk. The gesture was deliberate and final. Ladies and gentlemen, Ford said, addressing the audience directly for the first time since the confrontation began. I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here to be entertained, and instead you got to watch your host forget the basic principles of hospitality and respect. He turned back to Colbert one final time. Stephen, I hope someday you learn the difference between being provocative and being cruel. Until then, I suggest you find guests who are willing to tolerate this kind of treatment, because I assure you, I am not one of them. Ford walked toward the edge of the stage, his departure as commanding as his presence had been throughout the confrontation. Just before he reached the exit, he turned back one final time. "Oh, and Stephen?" Ford's voice carried clearly across the stunned studio. "Next time you want to ambush someone, you might want to pick someone who doesn't have 4 decades of experience dealing with people exactly like you." With that final devastating blow, Harrison Ford walked off the Late Show stage, leaving behind a shell-shocked host, a stunned audience, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. The camera stayed on Colbert for several long seconds, capturing his obvious struggle to process what had just happened, before finally cutting to commercial. The damage was done, the confrontation was over, and Hollywood had just witnessed one of its most private and professional actors reach his absolute breaking point in the most public way possible. Stephen Colbert had pushed too far, and Harrison Ford had pushed back harder than anyone could have imagined. So what did you think about this incredible confrontation? Do you think Harrison Ford was justified in his explosive reaction? Or do you think he should have handled Stephen Colbert's provocations differently? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories from Hollywood that you won't hear anywhere else.